The N-word. Do you know which one I'm talking about? The one that some people can say and other people can't? The old racial slur that some people are trying to reappropriate? That N-word. I remember the first time it was hurled at me. It was like an open-handed slap across the face. Gut-wrenching. Unexpected. I felt coated in its ugliness. I was in grade 3. And it was hurled at me by one of my best friends, Nikki. And just for the record, that's not her real name. I remember being shocked, surprised. Where did she learn this word? I mean, at that point, I was the only minority, one of the only minorities in a school of about 400. But never before had my status been so explicitly highlighted. My father was the only black teacher at the school. He was well-dressed, funny, all the kids loved him, and this was pre-Cosby Show. That means something. And, at some stage, that gave me some shelter, gave me a special status, maybe even a little arrogance. But that day, I felt like somehow I was on a visitor's pass, and that somehow I wasn't fully accepted. Now, don't get me wrong, I knew I was different. I had a crazy afro and crazy not in a good way when long, flowing hair was the trend. I had these big lips and this big nose and this dot on the side of my face that everyone kept on walking up to me and wiping off because they thought it was chocolate. I knew I'd never play the Virgin Mary in the church Christmas pageant. But I always got to be an angel, so it really wasn't that bad. But somehow, being tarred that day with that N-word shook me to the core. Looking back, I don't quite remember even where I had learned it previously. I had lived a pretty sheltered life. School, church, music lessons, play in the neighborhood. Church, school, music lessons, play in the neighborhood. At that point, I had been surrounded by my family, my mother's German Mennonite brother and family. My father's Haitian Catholic family had begun to arrive in Winnipeg, and at that time, a couple of my sisters. A pretty sheltered life. But also, I started wondering, where did Nikki learn that word? And not only where did she learn the word, where did she learn to use it like a weapon against me? Is that how her family talked at home? I ran to my dad at school that day, sobbing uncontrollably. I wanted to be consoled. I wanted to be told that she was wrong. I don't know exactly what I wanted to hear, but I remember that my expectations were not met. After finally getting the story out of his sobbing little girl, my dad looked at me and said, "That is how the world sees you. Get used to it. Stop crying." He gave me a hug and sent me back to class. Now, that was the last time that N-word brought me to tears, but it's not the last time I heard about it. And sometimes it comes in different forms: gender, age, identity, being ignored in a high-end store, being told that you were given your job, that you were a token hire, that university boyfriend who wouldn't bring me to meet his parents, sitting in a business meeting, having the title of director, and being told by a senior official that the discussion wasn't appropriate for the secretary, and could you please leave? Being called it on the phone by an angry client. He'd seen me on TV. It. Sticks and stones may break or hurt my bones, but it's the words that will forever shape me. So why is this important? Why is it important? Well, the moment you saw me step onto the stage, onto the screen, you started making judgments. And don't worry, I do the same thing. I'd like to pretend that my grade 3 experience formed me into a role model of acceptance and kindness. That somehow being subjected, though, to discrimination doesn't really mean that you won't discriminate against others. For a long time, I became even more rigid in my beliefs. I wouldn't listen to another perspective. I used sharp words to demean others. But you know what? I never used racist words, so it was really okay. And you see, I'd also like to say that that word, those names, didn't have power over me anymore. And in a way, they didn't. But in another way, they didn't have to. Because that first time cut so deep. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will forever shape me. Now, when I started preparing for this talk, I thought I could talk about the Canadian Museum for Human Rights without getting too personal. I've been the primary spokesperson for the museum since 2008 and didn't want to really make this about me. But what I realized is with a subject matter like human rights, it's inherently personal. To understand why I've dedicated the past 6 years of my life to the difficult, challenging act of helping to build a new national museum, to understand that, you have to understand my motivation. And my motivation is in part because of that 8-year-old girl. It's because of her that I've stayed focused on my path. And I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about Nikki. Because it's not just that that Nword was used against me. It's that she was taught to level it at me. She was taught to hate. And so whether you were the one with the fro, the one hurling the insult, or the bystander in the schoolyard that day, we all have a personal connection to human rights. And you know what? It isn't a competition to say who suffered more. Whether you're enjoying freedom today because of the battle of others, or whether you are in the trenches fighting right now, it's when we recognize that we all have a personal connection that we begin to end apathy. We have to stop saying, I don't have a human rights story. This is irrelevant to me. It's not. It's relevant to all of us. We all have a human rights story. Everyone in this room, all of us have a human rights story. And we also have a responsibility and a role to play in ensuring that the world is open and accessible to all. You see, every story in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is relevant to you because they transcend individual experience. Now, one of the greatest opportunities of my life has been at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, the opportunity to visit every province and territory in this country as part of our story gathering process. We met with human rights experts, academics, and everyday people. And people just came willing to share their story. And it was interesting because sometimes people came shyly. They felt guilty because their story wasn't that bad. But we had invited them to share their story, and it's amazing when invited how people are willing to open extremely painful, personal chapters of their life. Genocide, residential schools, loss of language and identity, glass ceilings. The list of stories we heard goes on and on. I've never cried so much with perfect strangers. And I remember coming home one week feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, discouraged. There was such cruelty and inequity that existed in this world. What's the point? What can we do about it? But you know what? I couldn't stay in that dark place. I couldn't, because the people who had shared their stories would not let me. Why? They had made the effort. They had interrupted their daily routine. They had come down to whichever downtown hotel or community center we were using. They came and they shared their story with me, with our content committee, for you, for all of us. They were contributing to Canada's National Museum, and they wanted to share their story. I remember a moment when I was in Halifax and heard the words that became my personal call to action. I was told, remember, you're not building a museum for human wrongs. You're building a museum for human rights. You see, when I talked to you about those stories of violation, I only told you half of the story. What many said, whether it be through tears, with conviction, with clarity, was, and they did not succeed. They tried to take my language. They tried to kill my people. They tried to tell me that I was less than human, but they tried, they did not succeed. I am still here. I am still here. Resilience, hope, perseverance. It's not neat and tidy. It's messy, it's controversial, it's complicated. It does not provide a roadmap to some promised land, but it is one of the boldest statements that a country and a people can ever make. Creating a place and a space for these stories and for these conversations. In about 100 days, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights will open its doors. It'll be a place and a space where we can share our stories. We're going to shed light into dark places. We're going to tell stories of how people resisted, overcame, and triumphed through discussion, dialogue, personal stories, stunning architecture and education programs that will reach students in every grade across this country, and its reach will expand around the world. And you know what? We'll even have programs for grade 3. And why is that important? Because hopefully, by the many short stories we'll share, we'll be better able to learn for each other. Because somewhere right now, there's a little girl called Nikki being taught to hate. And there's also another child who's at school right now, whose life will be forever changed by a playground incident. Thank you.